why life feels empty after retirement, and why no one ever warned you about it. My name is Mr. Alfred, and I want to talk about something that happens to millions of men every single year, something that blindsides them completely, something that society spent decades setting them up for without ever once preparing them for what comes after. Retirement. Not the idea of retirement. Not the brochure version with the golf courses and the grandchildren and the slow mornings with coffee on the porch. I mean the real thing. The thing that actually happens to men 6 months in, a year in, 2 years in, when the novelty has worn off and the silence has moved in and they are sitting in a house that used to feel like a reward and now just feels like a room they cannot escape. I want to talk about why so many retired men feel empty, why they feel purposeless, why the thing they spent 40 years working toward turns out to feel, in practice, like loss rather than arrival. And I want to do it honestly, without the greeting card language, without the self-help platitudes. Because the men experiencing this deserve a real conversation, not another reminder to stay positive and count their blessings. Let us start at the beginning, with what they actually built you for. From the time you were old enough to understand what adults did with their days, the message was consistent. Study hard, work hard, build something, provide, be reliable, be useful, contribute. The whole architecture of male socialization is organized around productivity and output. Your worth, from boyhood forward, was quietly but consistently tied to what you could do, what you could produce, what you could provide. This is not an accident. It is a feature. Society needed men who would show up, do the difficult work, take the dangerous jobs, carry the weight that needed carrying, and so it built men for exactly that purpose. It gave them an identity organized entirely around function. And for most of a man's working life, that identity it provides structure. It provides meaning. It provides a ready answer to the question that sits at the center of every human life. Why am I here? What am I for? Does my presence in the world matter? The job answers that question. Every day you go in, you have a role, you have people who depend on you. You have problems that need your specific attention. You are, in a concrete and daily way, necessary. And necessity is not a small thing. Necessity is one of the deepest forms of belonging a human being can experience. Then retirement arrives, and the necessity stops. And that brings me to a specific morning that almost every retired man can identify if you ask him honestly. It comes somewhere in the first year, maybe sooner. He wakes up and there is nowhere he has to be, nothing that requires him. No meeting, no deadline, no one waiting on his particular contribution to get through their day. And for the first time, possibly for the first time in his entire adult life, he has to sit with a question that his career was always answering for him. Now what? Most men are not prepared for that question. Not because they are weak or incapable, but because nobody prepared them. The entire infrastructure of male life, the education, the career, the decades of professional identity building, was designed to produce a man who is excellent at working. None of it was designed to produce a man who knows who he is when the work stops. So he finds himself at 65 or 70 with a resume full of accomplishments and a retirement party behind him and a watch with his name engraved on it. And absolutely no idea who he is now that the title is gone. Now hold that image and ask yourself something. If this were happening to women at the same scale, at the same intensity, with the same devastating regularity, would we be treating it as an invisible private struggle? Or would we be treating it as a public health concern demanding real attention and real resources? We know the answer, because we have seen how society responds when female identity crises are named and organized around. The books get written. The support communities get built. The cultural conversation opens up to make space for the experience. The infrastructure of care mobilizes. For men, the retirement identity crisis is largely invisible. It gets filed under personal adjustment. It gets met with well-meaning advice about hobbies and travel. The depth of what is actually happening, the collapse of a man's entire sense of self and purpose, goes largely unnamed. And unnamed suffering is the hardest kind to survive. Now, here is something that almost never gets said plainly enough, and it has to do with the social architecture of a man's life. For most men, work is not just a source of income and identity, it is their entire social infrastructure. Think about how male friendships actually function. They are almost always built around shared activity. The guys you work with, the guys you coach or play alongside, the people whose company you enjoy in the context of doing something together. Male friendship is fundamentally activity-based. Remove the activity, and far more often than anyone wants to admit, the friendship quietly dissolves. This is not a character flaw. It is a structural reality of how male social bonds form and are maintained. Men bond through doing. They connect through proximity and shared purpose. The conversations that matter happen in the margins of shared work, not in scheduled emotional check-ins. So when retirement removes the work, it does not just remove the income and the title and the daily structure. It removes the social ecosystem entirely. The colleagues you spent more waking hours with than your own family are suddenly people you have no natural reason to see. The friendships that felt solid and real were, it turns out, built on scaffolding that retirement quietly dismantled. And men find themselves socially isolated in a way they never expected and often cannot name. Because to name it would be to admit that they are lonely. And men have been taught their entire lives that loneliness is a thing you manage quietly, not a thing you say out loud. Now imagine, again, if this were the female retirement experience. Imagine if retiring women reliably lost their entire social network within 12 months of leaving work. Imagine if female loneliness in retirement were documented at the rates that male loneliness actually is. The response would be immediate. The policy, the programming, the community infrastructure, the cultural attention would follow. Because female isolation would be treated as the human crisis it is, male isolation in retirement is also a human crisis. The research is there. The men are there, sitting alone in houses that used to feel like rewards. And the response remains mostly silence. I also want to talk about the dream itself, because it matters how this story was sold to men for the duration of their working lives. The promise was simple. Work hard now, sacrifice now, delay now, and at the end of it, you get the reward. Freedom. Rest. Your time, finally, belonging entirely to you. It was framed as a rival, as the destination that justified the entire journey, and men believed it, because it made the sacrifice bearable. The long hours, the missed dinners, the weekends lost to work, all of it had a story attached to it. The story was this. This is temporary. The payoff is coming. Hold on, the payoff came. And for many men, it felt nothing like what they were promised, because freedom, it turns out, is not the same thing as fulfillment. Rest is not the same thing as peace. Having your time belong to you means nothing if you do not know what to do with it. If you have spent 40 years building an identity organized entirely around productivity and have never once asked yourself who you are beneath the job title, the retirement dream was real in its way. The golf and the travel and the slow mornings exist. But they exist alongside something nobody put in the brochure: the loss of purpose, the loss of structure, the loss of the daily sense that you are needed, that you are contributing, that your presence in the world is making a concrete difference to something or someone. Men were not warned about that part. Not really. And so they arrived at the destination and found themselves standing in the middle of what was supposed to be the reward, feeling a specific kind of grief that they had no language for because nobody gave them the language. Because naming that grief would have disrupted the story that kept them working through the difficult years. Now let us look at what the research actually shows, because these numbers deserve your full attention. Male depression rates spike significantly in the first 2 years following retirement. Male suicide rates among men over 65 are among the highest of any demographic group in the country. Male social isolation in retirement correlates directly with accelerated cognitive decline and dramatically shortened life expectancy. Men who retire without a strong sense of purpose outside of work die, on average, years earlier than men who maintain structured roles and social connection. These are not small numbers attached to rare experiences. These are patterns playing out at scale across millions of men. A generation of men who did exactly what society asked of them, who worked and provided and sacrificed and arrived at the destination they were promised, and who are now quietly falling apart in ways that nobody seems to find urgent. If these numbers described women, if retired women were experiencing depression spikes, suicide rate increases, accelerated cognitive decline, and shortened life expectancy at these rates, the response would look like a national emergency. Research funding would follow. Policy would follow. The machinery of social concern would mobilize with the speed and scale we have seen it mobilize before when female health and well-being are perceived to be at serious risk. For men, the response has been to tell them to find a hobby. That is not an exaggeration. That is the practical reality of how this conversation gets handled. Men arrive at one of the most psychologically complex transitions of their lives, and the cultural advice available to them is this: golf, grandchildren, travel, volunteer somewhere. As if a man whose entire sense of self was built around 40 years of professional identity can simply swap it out for a recreational activity and feel whole. So why did no one warn you? The answer to that question is important. The reason no one warned you is the same reason so many male struggles go unnamed. It does not fit the story. The story that governs how we talk about male experience positions men as the beneficiaries of the system. Men built the careers. Men accumulated the wealth. Men got the power and the status that comes with professional success. The retirement, in this story, is the men collecting on all of that, the men finally getting theirs. The idea that the men collecting their reward might be in genuine crisis, might be experiencing a collapse of identity and purpose and social connection, so severe it is taking years off their lives, disrupts the story. And so it gets minimized. It gets filed under personal adjustment. It gets met with the implication that these are men who had everything and are somehow still not satisfied, which misunderstands the problem entirely. This is not about satisfaction. It is not ingratitude. It is not men who had good careers failing to appreciate what they built. It is men who were built by their culture for a specific purpose, discovering that the purpose has ended and that nobody thought to equip them for what comes after. It is men experiencing the psychological consequences of a socialization that gave them an identity entirely dependent on function and then removed the function. It is men paying a price for a cultural arrangement that served everyone while it was running and left them stranded when it stopped. They were not warned because warning them would have required acknowledging that the arrangement had costs. That the expectation placed on men to derive their entire sense of worth and meaning from productive output was not just a feature of male life, but a burden that would come due eventually. Now, I am not going to end this without saying something real about what actually helps. Because men in this situation deserve more than a diagnosis. They deserve a direction. What the research and what honest conversations with men who have navigated this well consistently shows is this: the men who come through the retirement transition with their sense of self intact are the men who, before the work ended, began building an identity that existed outside of work. Not hobbies. Identity. There is a difference. A hobby is something you do. An identity is something you are. The men who thrive after retirement are the men who spent their working years also being a mentor, a present and active father, a member of a community, a builder of something beyond their career, a man whose sense of purpose had multiple roots rather than one. That kind of identity does not build itself overnight. It has to be cultivated, which is why this conversation matters most, not just for men already in retirement, but for men in their 40s and 50s who are still in the middle of the working years and still have time to build something underneath the career that will hold them when the career ends. The second thing that helps is community, real community. Not the activity-based professional adjacency that substitutes for friendship during working years, but genuine connection with other men who can speak honestly about what they are experiencing. That kind of community is rare for men. It has to be deliberately built. But it exists, and it makes a measurable difference to outcomes. And the third thing, the one that the research returns to consistently, is purpose, not productivity. Purpose. The distinction matters. Productivity is output measured by external standards. Purpose is contribution measured by meaning. Men who find ways to remain genuinely useful, to mentor younger people, to build things in their communities, to apply their experience in ways that matter to others, these men do not disappear into the silence that swallows so many of their peers. And so here is what all of this adds up to. Here is what the mirror shows when you hold it up honestly. We built men for a purpose and gave them no tools for the moment when that purpose ends. We sold them a dream and put nothing in the fine print about what the dream would cost them. We organized an entire social system around male productivity and built no infrastructure for male humanity once the productivity stopped. And the men who paid into that system their entire working lives are now discovering in retirement that the return on that investment was not what the brochure promised. That freedom without purpose is not freedom. That rest without structure becomes isolation. That arriving at the destination feels nothing like arrival when you do not know who you are now that the journey is over. This needs to be named. Not with bitterness, not with resentment, but with the clear-eyed honesty that the men experiencing it deserve. They are not failing at retirement. They are experiencing the predictable consequences of a preparation that was never given to them. The question is whether we are willing to give it to the next generation of men before they arrive at the same destination and find themselves standing in the same silence. My name is Mr. Alfred, and this conversation is just getting started.